Thank you all for joining. My name is Frank Martinez, and I'm a member of the Varonis marketing team. The topic of today's webinar is 5 things IT should be doing but isn't. Our presenter is Rob Sobers, Director of Inbound Marketing here at Varonis. This webinar is broadcast in the audio via your computer speakers. If you prefer to dial in, you can click on the microphone icon in the upper right corner and you'll get the number to get access to the audio feed. If you have any questions, please post them to the chat window and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. If you're having any technical issues, you can also post that to the chat window and I'll make sure that we get you sorted. Once this event closes, you'll be redirected to a page that offers a free threat assessment, as well as the opportunity to evaluate any of our products. This webinar is also offering 1 ISC squared CPE credit for attending. If you're looking for this credit and you didn't submit your ISC squared member number when you were registering, you can email it to me at fmartinez@varonis.com or reply to any of the reminder emails with that information. So without any further ado, I present Rob Sobers.
Thanks, Frank, and thank you everybody for joining me today. Topic of today's presentation is 5 things IT should be doing but isn't. Frank, can you hear my audio okay?
Yes, I can hear you well.
All right, then we'll begin. In case you're interested in getting the slides, I put a little link up here on the screen. It's bit.ly/5thingsit. The IT is capitalized, and you can always go there and grab a PDF copy of this slide presentation. I'll show it again at the end, and I'll also drop it in the chat room, so no need to copy it down. All right, a little bit about me. My name's Rob, and really, my title says Director of Marketing, but I'm an engineer at heart. I've been an engineer since probably since I was 14 or 15 years old, started programming, and have written a couple books on software development and sort of in love with info security and all things related. So feel free to ask me as technical a question as you might have at the end when we start our Q&A. You can also follow me on Twitter at rsobers. And I wanted to mention our blog.varonis.com, where we post almost exclusively educational material for IT people. So that would include stuff on the latest compliance regulations that are out there, courses on how to learn web security, PowerShell, things about ransomware. It's just a big sort of smorgasbord of IT-related education. So feel free to check that out. For those of you who aren't familiar with what Varonis is, maybe you stumbled on this webinar from a friend or something like that, we started operations in 2005, and as of September, we have over 4,000 customers ranging across multiple industries, from higher education to automotive, financial services, government, you name it. Anybody with sort of a file server and a heartbeat would find some sort of value in some of the products we make. And really the overarching theme of our product suite is that we help you secure your data from the inside out. And you'll hear a little bit about that during this presentation. Real quickly, before we hop into the 5 things, I wanted to mention how Varonis got started, because I think it's an interesting story and kind of relates to some of the topics that I'm going to talk about today. So our co-founders, Yaki Feitelson and Ohad Korkis, they were working at NetApp. They were both storage consultants, and they were working on a job that was in Angola, which is off the western coast of Africa. And part of that project was to deploy deep sea divers and submarines to take high-res photos of the ocean floor. And they were storing these high-res photos, which are extremely valuable and costly to create, on their NetApp filers. And then one day they were just gone. They had disappeared. And the leader of the project looked at Yaki and Ohad and said, well, you guys are the storage geniuses. Tell us what happened. Who had access? Who did have access? What do the logs say? Were we hacked? You know, they had all these questions coming up about this data that they valued so much. And unfortunately, they had to answer back, we don't know. We just don't, on these storage platforms where we're keeping this data, we have no visibility, no intelligence as to auditing or permissions visibility. So they were able to luckily restore the photos from backup, but it was a big fiasco. And so Yaki and Ohad looked at each other and said, there is a massive business idea here, because organizations are storing more and more data. It's harder to figure out what's valuable, what's not, and they need the kind of intelligence and protection that we didn't have. All right, now that that's behind us, I have the agenda up on the screen. So first we're going to talk about the new normal. So what tends to be sort of the narrative in IT today, especially as it relates to protecting and managing data. Then I'm going to talk about a new approach, sort of the approach that that we take at Varonis with our customers, and sort of the overarching philosophy that we live by here at Varonis. And then we'll dive into the 5 things that IT should be doing. All right, so what is the new normal? So for many of us in IT, the new normal is that we cannot trust the perimeter anymore. It used to be that anybody who was on the network was sort of in the building, they were supposed to be there, there wasn't a lot of risk in outsiders sort of phishing credentials and then remotely connecting to your network and getting on the network and snooping around and then exfiltrating. There just wasn't that type of connectivity, like broad connectivity, the way there is now, where you can connect from many different devices, mobile devices, remotely, VPN-less or over VPN. And so the game has sort of changed. Many companies, they have a lot of unstructured data, files, emails, etc., sitting around that's sensitive. Nobody knows it's sensitive because it's not being classified. Nobody knows where it is and if it's overexposed. So heaps and heaps of data, none of it sort of prioritized and secure. And what happens is either malicious insiders or attackers who found their way in snoop around, they find this stuff, they access it without being monitored, without triggering any alarms, and then they siphon it out of the company. They leak it or they exfiltrate it. They upload it to an FTP server, they put it into Dropbox, they put it on a USB drive, and sort of none of that is ever kind of, we don't know it's ever happening. In the cases that we do know it's happening, if you look at a lot of the breaches that happen, it's like it was happening months and months before it was discovered. And if you think about how often that happens, and then think about how often breaches are happening that nobody ever discovers, I'm sure that far outweighs the number that we do discover. And so there's sort of this vulnerability, this deep vulnerability, this sort of soft center, so to speak. There was this presentation just a couple of days ago at a security conference, Black Hills Information Security, and a gentleman, John Strand, put up this slide, and I thought this was really interesting. And I realize this is kind of meta, having someone else's slide up on my slide. But he said Sony wasn't the anomaly; they're the norm. So we shouldn't make fun of Sony. We shouldn't use them as a negative example. They are, in actuality, the way most companies are these days. And so we need to learn from them and follow through with sort of the belt and suspenders type of data protection. They had documents with passwords. Those sensitive documents were on open shares, but nobody knew. Nobody realized that. It's hard to hunt and peck for those different things without some sort of automation. Someone got on the network. They were able to navigate around without triggering any kind of anomaly detection. And then, you know how the rest of the story goes. So the way we look at this problem at Varonis is we say, well, what about taking the inside-out approach? Instead of trying to seal the perimeter and assume that everybody on the inside is doing the right thing at all times, or is who we think they are, what if we locate the assets that we need to protect? So if something is sensitive, we should know about it and figure out who has access to them now. So if it's sensitive and overexposed, we can change that. And who doesn't need to have access to them? So which employees in the organization have access to more information than they actually need to do their jobs, right? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people on this call right now who have access to information that they don't really need, but maybe they have it because they were in a role and they switched jobs and nobody ever revoked it. Nobody calls the help desk and says, you know what, I stumbled upon this file that I don't think I should have access to. Can you please figure out why I have access and revoke it? It just doesn't, the world just does not work that way. People are busy. They have too many things to do. Many IT departments are kind of managing access requests and revocations through spreadsheets and help desk tickets, and it's just not an easy thing to do, especially at bigger companies where there's just tons of data, lots of employees, systems that we don't even know about that are in the environment that have come online that we haven't discovered yet. So there's a lot of different variables, which makes this very hard to do. And then once we understand that, it's like, now we need to understand exactly what's happening with the data. So even if we're confident that everything is locked down, we know what we have, we know where the sensitive stuff lives, what about monitoring the people who are actually touching that data? What are they actually doing with it? Are the actions that they're performing legitimate? Are they anomalous? Do we have somebody who's infected with malware and now they're modifying everything that they have access to, encrypting it perhaps? How do we spot that? So by addressing the problem from this standpoint, from an inside-out approach, looking at the assets we want to protect, and then kind of working outward, we can have better success. And as you start asking the question, well, what do we need to do this? What do we need to take this approach? What kind of information do we need? It really boils down to 4 key pieces of metadata. So you have to have the user and group information. This is the information you can pull from Active Directory, LDAP, NIS, all of the local user accounts and groups that exist on your servers. And if you can pull that into a database, now you have a map of who's in the environment. The next thing you do on the upper right here is grab the permissions information. So that means crawling every single access control list on each platform where you store information. So Windows file shares, NAS devices, SharePoint, Exchange, everywhere, every data container. We crawl, at least this is what Varonis technology does. We grab the ACLs and then we correlate them to the user and groups that are on those access control lists. And now we can start answering questions like who has access to data? What would happen if I removed this person from this permissions group? What data are they losing access to? So it really gives you that bidirectional view of data access. And without collecting this information on a daily basis, your visibility becomes stale, right? So you're either in a state where you don't have that visibility at all, or your visibility is incorrect. So you have to kind of collect that on a daily basis. The next thing on the bottom right is looking inside the files or attachments or SharePoint data and seeing what content matches sensitive strings that you've identified are important to your business. So for instance, credit card numbers, account numbers, patient IDs, anything that would be deemed potentially sensitive. And then you can start asking questions like, where do I have sensitive information that is overexposed? Or who has access to patient information in my company or credit card data? And then lastly, the hardest thing to do is to collect the access activity. So every single time someone opens a file, modifies a file, deletes a file, reads an email, marks an email as unread, accesses a SharePoint library or something like that, collect that in real time, know who did it, when they did it, where they did it from, how often, all of that information. And then you can synthesize that and really get a good picture of what's going on in your business. All right, so now that you have a general overview of the approach and the philosophy behind inside-out security, now let's talk about the 5 sort of action items that we think are the top 5 things you could be doing or should be doing, but maybe aren't. So the first thing is turning the lights on. So really what this boils down to is classifying your sensitive information, inventorying your permissions, and enable auditing. So what does that look like? So first thing first is employ some sort of data at rest scanning, whether this is a DLP software or something like the Varonis data classification framework. Regardless, you should be able to scan your infrastructure and identify files that are important to you, because otherwise you're sort of treating all folders and all servers as equal. And that may not be the case. There might be some data repositories that are way more sensitive than others and warrant much more control. So figuring out where that stuff resides is super important. Next, determining who can access it. This goes back to the access control lists that I talked about. If you can't answer that question, then you have no idea how vulnerable your sensitive data is. And then lastly, turning on that auditing, like I mentioned before, which is to figure out who's accessing it. Does it get accessed at all, right? If you have tons of sensitive information sitting in a folder and nobody has used it in the past 6 months, that's risk that's just sitting there without any kind of merit to it. You know, you could eliminate that, you can archive it, and then if an attacker does gain access to users' credentials, that data won't be exposed because it's gone. So what does auditing give you? You know, many people are shy about turning on auditing because so many of the native auditing subsystems especially Windows auditing, Exchange journaling and diagnostics, all of the auditing subsystems on Linux and Unix, they are very performance intensive. And they give you output in some sort of very verbose log. It's hard to analyze. It's hard to, you have to scrape it. It's just not a great usable feature in most platforms, which is why at Varonis, this is one of the main things that we do, is to unintrusively capture these audit events on multiple platforms, whether it be Active Directory, SharePoint, Windows, NAS, etc., and then normalize it, analyze it, and put it in a form that can be easily searchable and sortable. And then once you have a usable audit trail, you get things like being able to statistically detect unusual behavior. So baseline everybody's normal behavior, and then when it changes or spikes in a weird way, you can be alerted. You can detect when people are deleting tons and tons of files. If they've gotten malware on their machine and now they're crawling the network shares and deleting tons of files or modifying tons of files, you can detect that. You can see when people are getting added to privileged groups. You can detect failed login attempts if you're auditing Active Directory. If you're doing the classification that we talked about and measuring activity, you can see who's modifying and accessing sensitive data at any given point, and you can build rules around that. Detect changes out of change control window. So violations in your policies, violations by your IT admins, and so much more. So I really think that auditing is one of the core tenets of security today, and it sort of should be sort of your lifeblood for any good security program. All right, so once you have the instrumentation in place, you've discovered where your sensitive data is, you've figured out who can access it, and you've got auditing turned on so you can detect anomalies. The next thing is to fix the biggest problems. So take all that information that you've discerned from your instrumentation and boil it down to the biggest problems that you can fix to get the biggest results. Here's a little insight from our friend Swift on Security. If you don't follow this account on Twitter, I highly recommend it. It's not just a humorous account. He or she, whomever runs this account, obviously it's a parody, but puts forth a lot of great tips on security, especially Windows security. So if you're a Windows admin or on a security team that has to manage a Windows environment, there's some gems in there. But I like this tweet because it says, company hires crack InfoSec team, and they ask to remove admin from everybody. And the sort of punchline is that the help desk doesn't know how to work without users being admin. And this leads me into my next tip, which is not everybody should have access to everything, right? So I can't count the number of times that we walk into an environment and things like the everyone group or authenticated users are applied to very sensitive areas on the network. So task number one should be to scan your access control list and look for these groups, look for everyone, look for authenticated users. These are sort of low-hanging fruit, and then figure out where these groups are applied on folders that contain sensitive information. So you're getting the junction point between sensitive and overexposed. And more often than not, we'll find at least a handful of folders that have credit card numbers or patient IDs or some sort of sensitive information in a folder that is open to everybody. This can happen for a variety of reasons. If someone's being lazy and they just want to add the everyone group to a folder to give one user access without figuring out the right group to add, that oftentimes happens. Another problem is that maybe you grant the everyone group thinking that folder should be public, and maybe there's nothing sensitive in it at the moment, but then somebody drags and drops a spreadsheet in there that contains sensitive information at a later date. How are you to know, right? And of course, the question that I often get when I recommend this is, well, we tried to eliminate everyone group, but then every time we tried to do it, we'd get a phone call at the help desk saying that we've broken access for a bunch of people. And so one thing Varonis does, this is one of my favorite features, is we let you simulate this change. So you can remove the everyone group in a sandbox and run a simulation that shows you all of the users that would have called you to complain if you had made the change 30 days ago. right? Because we have that audit trail of all the access activity on those folders, we know exactly which users were accessing data in that folder via the everyone group and had no other way to do it. And you can keep simulating, you can add different groups to the folder, rerun the simulation until you're happy with your new configuration for that folder, and then you can commit it right through the Data Advantage product. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is if you don't have Varonis, you can sit by the phone and kind of deal with the requests as they come in. It's probably worth it for the security mitigation. And sort of staying along the same lines, in addition to the global access groups, also eliminating just excessive permissions that people have. So figuring out what people have access to but really don't need. And the way we do it with our software is we look at what a user accesses and we look at their group memberships. And this all happens programmatically behind the scenes. So there's a machine learning algorithm that looks at what you're accessing and then figures out when you've stopped accessing that information that the security groups that you're a member of grant you. And it goes a step further as well. It starts looking at the other people in those security groups and matching your behavior to theirs. And if you don't look like those people anymore, then we flag you for removal. So it kind of works like Amazon's recommendations, where it's based on your own behavior and behavior of those that are like you. And so it turns out to be like well over 99% accurate, like 99.9% accurate when we flag somebody for removal. And then you can show that report to somebody in that department and say, hey, this person came up on a report, looks like they don't need access to your finance data anymore. Is this true? And they can say, yep, go ahead, remove them. And that's a great way to eliminate this permissions creep problem that we all know and love. A couple other quick tips here is you can have your provisioning system. Hopefully you have one that does this, but having auto expiry on temporary access is huge. So when you grant the access, there's no better time to think about revocation than at the point when you're giving access. So if you have a contractor or someone that's working on a temporary project, you want to be able to grant them access for a certain number of days and then have the system revoke it when that expiration date comes, rather than maintaining some sort of manual spreadsheet. And even better if you can have the business review these entitlements at some point. So rather than having somebody in IT worry about it, you just have the business manage it. Which segues nicely into the next tip, which is move the responsibility for data out of IT. And this is a very ambitious to do for everyone here, I think. But it's one worthwhile when our customers get to this point where they've offloaded the responsibility for access control decisions outside of IT. Life becomes better for everybody. So that means assigning owners, establishing a process for granting and revoking access and reviewing it, and then automating that process. There's this article about this topic on Harvard Business Review, and the link is in the slides, but the author makes the point. He says, you don't manage people assets the same way you manage capital assets, nor should you manage data assets in the same way you manage technology assets. It would be the most fundamental reason for moving the responsibility for data out of IT. And basically he argues that the common approach, the common thought when people aren't thinking deeply about this is that, oh, the data lives in the computer, so it must be IT's responsibility, right? That's like saying that the people sit in the building, so performance review should be done by the building management team, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's like the building management crew has no idea how well Sally in accounting has done this quarter, or whether she needs access to data or anything like that. So the same thing applies for IT. When we get a permissions request come in through the help desk, and it's like, oh, Sally in accounting needs access to the company S1 statement, it's like we have no idea. We're just serving as a middleman or a middlewoman. We have to go to that person's boss, and sometimes that person's boss is not even the right person, and it becomes this back and forth where we're wasting our time, and we're not the right people. We don't have the right context to make this decision. We should focus on technology, not the actual data. And so we actually built a whole product around this concept at Varonis. It's called Data Privilege. And what we do is we look at, again, that activity feed. So what are people accessing? And we determine for each group or each folder tree in the environment, who uses the data the most. And then that person, in this case on this pie chart, Dana Burr, which person looks like the owner, or at least gets us close to identifying a business owner for this data set. And then we can assign them ownership in Data Advantage. And what that does is, if you're using data privilege, it says, okay, this person, this owner, should get a report, an email every quarter, every month, however long you want to make it, saying it's time to review access, right? And so maybe it's once a quarter, and they'll get an email that says, here are the people that have access to your data. Do you want to keep them, remove them, or do nothing? And then you can digitally sign it, and all of the changes that you specified will come to pass without involvement from IT. Additionally, you can have a web form where people who want new access, so if I need access to a specific folder or want to be a member of a specific group for a project or something like that, I submit a web form, and based on the ownership rules, data privilege will route that request to the proper owner. And it circumvents IT completely. That owner gets an email and they can say approve or deny, and then access is granted at that time. And there is no risk of the business users doing any harm to your infrastructure. One of the questions I often get there about that is, well, if the business owners are granting access to folders, does that mean they can modify Active Directory? And the answer is no. Everything is delegated. It's done by our software. So the user gets an email and they say yes or no to approve the access request, and then our software parses that response and then goes to Active Directory and makes the right change to make that happen. All right. Next tip, analyze and alert on user behavior. So again, this boils down to that audit trail. We want to baseline everybody's normal activity. So on a given day, certain users modify a certain number of files on average. And if they ever go beyond that by an extreme amount, let's say 10 standard deviations away from what they normally do on a given day, maybe it's time to flag that user and investigate. Because it could be that they're about to resign and they're grabbing everything they have access to, or they have CryptoLocker installed on their machine and it's modifying every file that it has access to. You can also use that activity feed if you've got an alerting subsystem on top of it to determine changes outside of change control windows, weird modifications of files that are from different locations or something like that. There's a lot of things you can do with alerts. One alert that I think every company should kind of not go without is being notified anytime somebody gets super user access in a Windows environment. So the equivalent would be a new member of the domain admins group in Active Directory. It shouldn't happen every week. Probably shouldn't happen every month. So when it does happen, it's not a noisy alert. We should know about that. So you set up that alert in Active Directory, and at least you have an assurance that you'll know if there's somebody who's trying to escalate or has successfully escalated to that level of access. And I mentioned CryptoLocker a couple times, and our product Data Alert, which does user behavioral analytics, has a rule which you can configure, and we wrote this custom, and a lot of our customers have implemented it, and now in our new beta release, this, along with many other threat models, are completely available to you, so you don't have to write them yourselves. These are all common anomalous activities or risky behaviors that we can detect automatically for you, and malware is one of them. So with CryptoLocker, we noticed this very specific behavioral profile of modifying more than 100 files in under a minute, and then you can trigger that alert to do a bunch of things. You can send an alert to your SIM, you can kick off a script. And in our case, we recommended that you notify someone on the security team, and also do a little bit of a check on that user's registry to see if a specific key exists, and if it does, actually disable the account. And quite a few of our customers have successfully caught CryptoLocker in progress. with this rule. And the account got disabled, and 100 files got encrypted, but not 2 terabytes. So it's been a lifesaver for a lot of people. And I know CryptoLocker is kind of just getting worse and worse, all the different variants that are out there. So this is a great thing to have on your unstructured data. All right, last tip. Get control of Active Directory. Active Directory, as you all know, is sort of the keys to the kingdom. And there's a lot of things that Active Directory controls, from unstructured data access to access to applications. Just so many different things. Group policies, which could be disastrous if modified. So there's a lot of potential damage to be done via Active Directory if an attacker or a malicious admin kind of has free reign. So what we recommend is first and foremost, do a quick checkup on your Active Directory. There are some things that we always check for our customers when we first install our product, and this is sort of the list right here. Accounts with passwords that never expire, accounts that have never logged on, loop nested groups, duplicate SAM accounts, expired accounts. There's like a laundry list. We have a whole bunch of reports that run on your Active Directory and spit out all of these common errors. And this way you don't have to hunt and peck around Active Directory and say, okay, what's broken? You get nice formatted reports that show you exactly what your problem areas are. And then as far as monitoring on Active Directory, this is critical. I mentioned domain admins and getting that alert when anyone's added to that group or any changes are made to that group. But there are so many other events in Active Directory that are worth monitoring. Failed logins, account lockouts are key. And being able to take these events and correlate them to things on the file system or in other systems like SharePoint, etc., you can start to build a really clear and comprehensive picture of what a user is doing. So in the case of an attacker who's compromised an insider's credentials, you might be getting these failed login attempts from Varonis, along with unstructured data changes and file modifications from Varonis, and then piping that into your SIM, which is also getting information from your network and other sources. Maybe you've got a database security program that's feeding in that SIM as well. And now you start to get a really comprehensive picture of what's going on. But there's tons of other things in our Active Directory monitoring. You can see access requests, which is when the server's checking Kerberos tokens to see if someone's got access to a particular folder or something like that. Delegation, changes in delegations, etc. And then GPO changes is also super critical. And then lastly, another thing we do, and which I recommend even if you aren't a Varonis customer, is to trend some of these things. It really helps to see over time how your stats in Active Directory and on other systems as well are trending. So are the number of user accounts that are getting created, do they kind of match your employee count? Or are people creating user accounts for other reasons that maybe don't make sense? And by trending these things, you can sort of get a picture of the health of your environment. We have a whole bunch of KPI reports, and expect to see more if you follow our blog about that. So that's the end of my slides. I do want to mention that we have this sort of concierge assessment that we offer, and what we'll do is an engineer will come on site or over WebEx, help you install one or any of our products, and run a 30-day assessment where we're building reports, we're monitoring your environment, we're helping you clean things up, and then at the very end of that 30 days, we give you a nice report that says, here's where you were when we started, here's where you are now, here's all the things we did, and you get a nice sort of ROI report. And I highly recommend to go through that. You might learn something about your environment that you can really improve upon. So with that, I am happy to take questions. All right, let me see. I'm checking the chat room right now.
So Rob, we don't have any questions currently queued up, but please, anyone, if you have any questions, feel free to post them to the chat window. We just got our first one in right now that's asking, how many products did you just cover? 2?
So I covered essentially 3 products: Data Advantage, Data Alert. Actually, 4. Sorry, Data Advantage, Data Alert, our classification framework, and Data Privilege. Well, for all intensive purposes, our metadata framework, which is sort of our underlying platform, is what powers all of the products I talked about today. And so really it's one installation. And then based on the features that you need or want, you turn on different licenses, essentially. The base product is called Data Advantage. That's usually what people start with. And then you pick the platforms that you want to monitor. So if you have Active Directory, you can turn on Active Directory. If you have Windows, you can turn on Windows file systems, Unix, Isilon. If you have NAS, EMC NAS, NetApp, HP, etc. So it's super modularized and very easy to manage your licenses.
We have 2 new questions that just came through. The first is asking, can it pull ACLs out of old access databases?
That's a great question. So the answer to that one is no. Pull the access control list from the supported platforms, which in our case tend to be unstructured or semi-structured platforms. Things like file servers, SharePoint Exchange, Office 365 even. But we don't cover databases. That's not our sweet spot. So we won't go into Access or SQL Server, or MySQL, anything like that. However, I will mention that many times, even our customers who have database servers like SQL servers or MySQL servers, whatever the case may be, they'll use Varonis to monitor those servers because at the end of the day, those databases are files that live on the file server. So you've got those, the MySQL dump files, which are text, right? Sitting in a file server, those backups, those are all files that if someone got a hold of or someone that wasn't supposed to access them was accessing them or deleting them, you'd want to know about. So to that side of the equation, we do provide value, but we won't reach inside of a database server and kind of help you determine those access control lists.
Our next question was asking, how are you grabbing the machine a user is logged on? What would the rule filters for that alert be?
That's a good question too. So we're grabbing the event at the operating system level, right? So let's use a Windows server as an example. When the server gets the request for the file, whether it's through like a map drive or whatever, the server OS knows the connection, right? So it's got the user account, it's got the IP address that's coming over the network via the CIFS protocol, and then it knows what time it is, what type of access event it is, and we have our own filter that runs on that file server that's collecting this information. So you don't have to turn anything on as far as native auditing that's going to be like writing this to a file that we're scraping. It's all determined by our filter, which is listening for these events. So it's got a bunch of different metadata along with that one event, so a file modify, etc. And then any of that metadata that we collect about that event, name of the file, name of the path of the file, time of day that it happened, the type of change it was, all of that is available to the rules engine so that you can create an alert on it. And I probably have a screenshot somewhere of the rule creation screen, which I'll pause my sharing real quick and see if I can pull that up for you so you can see what it looks like. Any other questions in the meantime?
Yeah, we have 2 additional questions which are asking. The first is saying, how many licenses would you need for a common enterprise network?
So I would say what we mostly see, for a Windows environment, it honestly depends on how many platforms you have where you store data. But for a 1,000 user company that's primarily Windows and like NAS, you would need one license for a bulk of our features in Data Advantage. And then let's say you wanted to also classify information. So you wanted to look inside the files and see what's sensitive. That would be another license, albeit a much less expensive one. And then let's say you wanted to add the user behavioral analytics on top of that, then that would be 3 licenses. So that would give you a lot of power with those 3 licenses. And again, we have bundles that include those 3 sort of packages, and it's quite affordable in my view. But you get to pick and choose which packages you want.
And we have one additional question that's asking, is there currently support for IBM iSeries platforms, AS400?
That's a good question. So we support any like CIFS-based NAS device. So IBM, I know their series of NAS devices that they make, we do support. So that would be a yes. As far as AS400 goes, I don't know off the top of my head. Thinking no.
We have another question regarding compatibility, and it's asking, do the products work with IaaS and SaaS?
That's a good question. So far, there's no like SaaS compatibility, so no like Dropbox or Salesforce type of integration at the moment. But for infrastructure as a service, we do support Azure. We support SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Exchange Online. So I guess it depends what you consider those SaaS or infrastructure as a service. We do support the Office 365 and Azure platforms. That's sort of where we're starting, but I think you can expect more of that from us in the future. Our philosophy is sort of wherever your company information, your important company information is stored, that's where we want to kind of extend our functionality to. And the biggest demand from our customer base has been Office 365, and so that's what we did first, and that's fully available. And as far as deployment of our software, currently our software is deployed completely on-premise. So even if you're monitoring and doing alerting and all of the stuff on something like Office 365, the actual software that you're running is behind your firewall. So Varonis is installed completely on in your data center, and you can manage and control it, etc. We don't own any of your data. We can't see any of your data. So that's our current deployment model.
We have another question asking, what about USB drives?
No, so we're not currently doing anything for the endpoints. So one of our our main focus is on the server side, ensuring that only the right people have access to the right data where it lives, and then monitoring that access. So once the data is actually like on a machine of somebody who should access, we're not doing the endpoint modification. That's sort of where we hand it off to the endpoint, whatever endpoint solution's in place. So you can think of us as like your upstream management and protection, whereas one of the endpoint DLP products might be your solution for once it's on the actual endpoint device.
We have a data privilege specific question, and it's asking, for data privilege, do you require an authoritative source for the access certification, i.e. an HR feed?
Do we require a? We don't. Okay, so we don't require it. So there's a couple things. As far as assigning the data ownership, you can either use our methodology for doing that using the audit trail and figuring out who's actually modifying the data, or we can take a feed from your HR system. So we could say, if you have a system that has defined who should own what data on the your file servers or your shares, then we can take that in as a feed and assign the data ownership that way. And then those people who have been assigned will get their access certification requests, and then they'll sign them, etc. But there's no sort of requirement for that. You can manually assign owners. You can bulk upload owners. There's quite a variety of ways to set them.
So here's another asking, how much time does it take to manage a typical Windows 199 server environment?
I mean, I guess that's a good question. I mean, it really depends on what you mean by manage. When you first install our product, there's probably a handful of tasks during that onboarding phase where you got, the help of our engineers, where you're kind of getting things in order, and then it's all about kind of setting things up so that you have to do the least amount of management as possible while still getting the protection that you want, and that involves, automatically servicing recommendations for users who have too much access, and automatically doing the access recertifications and access requests. So the goal is to automate as much as possible, but also not to the point where you're unsure about the results you're getting. So if we feel that a human should intervene at some point, then we'll recommend that. But for certain common tasks, and we found in most cases the things that you're going to be doing in the Varonis framework are things that you've been doing all along, but have just been taking forever, like producing a permissions report for an executive or an auditor or something like that. Whereas within the common like native tools in Windows and in Active Directory, etc., it might take you half an hour or a day even to collect a permissions report. It's going to take you like 45 seconds with Varonis. So you end up saving a ton of time on reporting, on removing permissions, and ensuring you're not going to break anything. That's a super big time saver. And then obviously with data privilege, if you can implement that, we've seen people save hundreds of hours per week on from the IT department's time, and get better results as well.
So a follow-up from that person, and they're asking, does it handle end user requests?
Yeah, in the case of data privilege, permissions requests from end users, it handles. So the way it works, an end user opens up a web page. They select which folder they want access to or which group they want to be a member of, and then they explain why, and they click a button, and then that gets sent to the right person in the line of business so they can approve it automatically. And you can set up delegation and approval workflows. You can make it as complicated as you want, and then that approval, once accepted, will be executed. So that's sort of the product that really touches the end users.
Does the end user need to be already defined in order to submit the request?
Nope. The user that's making the request, they have to be in Active Directory, so they have to have a credential, um, but they don't have to be like defined specially in our product or anything like that.
We have another data privilege question here, and it's asking, does the data privilege access request process work inside of SharePoint?
It does. It didn't used to, but we got a ton of requests from SharePoint admins who have seen it working on Windows and said, "Oh my gosh, like the headache of managing user requests and granting permissions in SharePoint. Like if we could offload that as well." And so that was a big thing that we recently, I think we shipped it early this year. And you can also, in data privilege, create rules that sort of run behind the scenes. If you say like someone who belongs to this group should never have access to this resource, it's called ethical walls. Data privilege will sit there and watch for violations of that rule and automatically reset it. So if somebody tried to make a request through data privilege for that, it would be denied. Or if somebody made a change on the file server directly to grant somebody access to something that the rule said it would be a violation, then data privilege will catch it and revert it. So that's another key feature of data privilege. And I know we often have tech talks on data privilege as well, which goes into like the advanced usage and stuff like that. So when you get the web event digest from us each month, keep an eye out for that if you're interested. Or you can request a demo straight off, and we'll do a one-on-one where we dive deep into a walkthrough of data privilege. I'd be happy to do that.
We have an additional question for data privilege, and it's asking, does the end user need to log into data privilege in order to submit a request?
No, they just need access to the web page, the request form, which you can make public on your intranet. So they don't have to have any login or password for that.
Our next question is asking, when is the Concierge Assessment?
So basically, when the WebEx closes, you can, or when the web conference closes, you'll be redirected to a form. You just fill that out, and that will get routed to the team that's in your territory, wherever you are located, and then they will work with you to schedule that. So whenever it's convenient for you, if you want to do it over WebEx, they can remotely configure the product and run the assessment for you, or they can come on site. So it's a one-on-one thing, so you get to schedule it with your team.
Rob, you are screen sharing again, by the way.
Yeah, I decided to show the audit trail in case anybody's interested in how it looks. This is a query engine that you have up here. You can select the date range. You can select the number of machines, types of machines that you want to query, what type of events, etc. And then you run it, and you get a list of events that happened over the time frame, and you can like drag any of these columns to the top here to sort, and then I'll group it here by like event type, so I can see all the deletes, all the modifies. If I see something that I think is anomalous and I want to create an alert, I can say create data alert, and that will populate alert for me based on the event that I selected, and it's really cool. And you can see the different metadata we have for each of these types of operations. This is an access denied event on someone trying to delete a file. Here you see someone tried to delete this file 9 times. It's intangible assets.txt. It was done by Corp Aaron Manning. It's a file. It's on this server, and this is when it happened, how many times. You can open it up and get a more detailed view of that.
So we have 2 additional questions. The first is asking, does data privilege have the ability to crawl credentials within routers, firewalls, etc., or is it restricted to AD?
So it's restricted to the platforms that we cover. So it's not just restricted to AD. So in addition to the Active Directory users and groups, oftentimes on ACLs you'll see local accounts and groups that exist on that server, whether it's a Windows server, SharePoint, etc., Unix, and we can crawl those as well. We grab those as well. We can tell you what they have access to, what they've been doing. But as far as routers go, routers aren't something that we will manage for you. So we're not looking at the router itself, and not into firewalls either. So really, it is limited to the platforms that we manage. And you can see them actually in here. So we've got Unix, Linux, Windows file servers, and any supported NAS, Exchange, SharePoint, Active Directory itself, Office 365 as well, which isn't listed in here.
And this next question is somewhat related to that, and it's saying, from the various modules offered by Varonis for Data Advantage, which one is the one that is mostly used by their customers? And they also mentioned they would just like a use case for directory services since they currently don't have that module.
Okay, let me see. From the various modules offered, which one is the most used by other customers? So I don't think we've released officially any of those numbers about usage of specific products, nor do I have any of that data. But I will say anecdotally, the products that I see a lot of people trying these days and purchasing are Data Advantage. Our Data Alert product is very popular, especially since we last shipped this latest release, which is ships a whole bunch of threat models that kind of let you monitor and alert on anomalous behavior that you may not know is anomalous, but our algorithms detect. And then also, as you mentioned, Data Advantage for directory services. It's huge. Active Directory is such a key component, and being able to get those events is just kind of it's kind of something hard to live without once you've had it. You know, being able to detect group policy changes on AD outside of Windows and stuff like that. So I think if I had to name 3 based on just gut feel, Data Advantage, Data Alert, and then the directory services component of Data Advantage.
We have another question that's asking, what does the blocked message look like to the end user?
We're not like an intercept tool, so we're not going to actually intervene and block anybody from doing anything. I actually, he or she might be referring to the data privilege ethical wall feature that I mentioned. In any case, we don't message the end user because we're not typically doing any kind of blocking in real time. We're capturing the information, we're capturing what is happening, and then feeding it into our engine. And then any rules you might have about disabling accounts, etc., will be executed. And then if you decide to like disable an account or shut down access, like that's all done through the native tools. So if you're locking out an account, essentially Varonis will go to Active Directory and lock the account there. So they'll get whatever message Active Directory will give them. We're not living in between the native access control lists and Active Directory permissions and stuff like that. So it's very seamless in that way.
All right, well, that seems to be it for questions, and we've also hit the top of the hour. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you, Rob, for presenting.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for joining, and have a great rest of the day.
Just a few housekeeping things on your way out. Again, thank you, everyone. But just a reminder that you will be redirected once you close out of the WebEx to that free threat assessment, which is also the same form you can use if you're looking to see an evaluation or a free 30-day trial of any of the products that we were just talking about. For those of you who are looking for that ISC squared CPE credit, we certainly can tell that you attended, but the one thing that we need to have from you is your ISC squared member number. So if you didn't submit that in the form, just make sure that you reply to one of the reminder emails with that number, and we'll make sure we get those credits out your way. For those of you that are requesting the recording, we're also going to send that out to all the attendees from today sometime next week, so keep an eye out for that email. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We hope to see you at next month's events.